All right, well, greetings everyone. Good afternoon on this Monday morning, or I guess Monday afternoon. It's shiny, bright and shiny out here, so I hope it's that way for you as well. Kind of lifts the spirits a little bit to see the sun shining. Want to welcome you to our webinar today is using the open forum Adlerian model to build resilience through our virtual sessions. And we are very fortunate to have Dr. Jay Kolker from Adler University to host this particular session for us. And thank you so much. I'm going to take care of just a few housekeeping items before turning it over to him to get through this quickly. Everyone is muted, and this is a feature. I thought everybody was muted, and then so if you come on online, it should automatically mute you. If you are on the phone, I will ask you to mute your phone, and you can do that by hitting *6, and that will mute you. And I did find someone who wasn't muted, so I'll do that. So just know that you are muted, and and we ask that if you have questions, use the chat feature to ask those questions. I will be paying attention and bring those to Dr. Kolker's attention as he goes through the presentation. So if you have questions, please use that chat feature. This is being recorded, and this will help preserve the audio quality for the other folks who can't join us today. Additionally, we have either certificates of attendance or CEUs that will be available for this session. And so if you need those, you can email me and let me know that you need either a certificate of attendance, or if you are a clinician and you need the CEU, please specify which of those that you need, and I can make sure that we get those to you as well. If you need a CEU, you will have to fill out an evaluation, and I can get that to you. And here in a minute, I'll put my email address in the chat feature so you have that as well. With that, Dr. Kolker is going to spend some time going through the webinar, and he will pause at certain points for questions, but feel free to type those in as you have them. You don't have to wait for that. And I think with that, I'm going to turn that over to you, Dr. Kolker.
Well, I'm so excited to be able to provide this opportunity for support and shared learning from this perspective. I understand, well, maybe I should say it differently. I can only imagine. I'm not in your shoes, so I can't fully understand the current challenges you're facing and those of the populations that you serve. But I can only imagine how it must be for youth and families today being so hunkered down, youth being held up with families that may not be the most supportive. But there are still ways of building resilience to help them address some of their immediate stresses and mitigate some of the longer term effects of this potential health crisis. So I would like to briefly speak about goals for today a little bit, and also about virtual engagement. There are ways to foster feelings of inclusion and belonging. Certainly, support can be enhanced, even with the distance that's there. And there can be some improved coping strategies, reducing stress, enhancing feelings of encouragement and optimism, helping people see a range of alternatives to what they're facing right now, feeling a little bit more connected to the community of caring professionals, and I might say, even more importantly, to peers, to other people that they can really identify with that are sharing similar challenges and concerns, and certainly building on strengths that are already being utilized. I'd like to spend just a few moments talking about my own background, putting things in context, and maybe a little bit speaking to my credibility in being able to talk about this model and approaches. I received my master's in counseling psychology from Alfred Adler Institute, which then became the Adler School of Professional Psychology and now Adler University. I actually started my studies in the mid-1970s, and part of that process, even before, I was being extensively trained in family counseling, and I'll spend a little bit more in just a moment talking about the approach that I learned within the open form model. But I was a licensed clinical professional counselor for many years. I then managed clinical facilities. At my peak in that work, I was the director of a hospital chemical dependence program. I oversaw all inpatient and outpatient operations and ran a clinical training program to graduate 40 people per year to enter the field of addictions counseling. I also, along the way, got a Doctor of Management degree as I became more and more interested in leadership and management. And now I'm semi-retired, but still teach master's and doctoral students at Adler University. Over the years, I was extensively trained in an approach called the open form family counseling model. I'll give a little bit more history in a moment about Adler's work in this area, but I'll share a couple examples of the work and what I was trained to do. So on a given Saturday morning in the greater Washington, D.C. area, this was in the mid-1970s, there was a very active family education center. And there were members to this center that joined and actually paid, I think it was $35 a year to be a member. And every other week, they would come, parents and people interested in family counseling would come to this meeting place. And in many weeks, there were 200 or 300 people in the audience. And I received extensive training in working with a real family. Of course, there were some limitations of confidentiality, what we might choose to share within an open setting, but we covered many common everyday occurrences. And we would work with the real family in front of the audience, but the audience were what we called co-educators. And we tapped into their knowledge, their experience, their observations, what worked for them, their observation of strength in the family we were working with. And I'll spend more time talking about that model and the shared goals and how it works and how we might educate the family and the value so they're open to doing that. And it was amazing how dynamic the work was and how engaged everybody in the audience was. And people came back literally every other week for 2-3 years because they got so much out of it. We also did couples education centers where we worked with couples in that same way. That's another story. I, for 4 years, ran Adler School's Family Education Center in the mid-1990s. We had, over time, 200 or 300 people that attended those meetings, and very similar process of working with the family. And once the families that came observed the work and saw it wasn't so threatening, many people volunteered their families to come and do work with me. Subsequently, I developed a model of working with leaders within a similar kind of group open form format, and I created my own business called Crowdsourced Coaching that led to leader engagement, leader to leader learning within one company and across companies, and I still do some of that work today. So that's a little bit about my background and experience. I noted I would speak about the history of the open form model. Alfred Adler saw this as a natural extension of his community engagement work in the mid 1920s, whereas many professionals at that time thought that only the experts could do the work and they had all the knowledge, and that the clients or the patients were ones that had to listen to the experts. Adler's beliefs were quite different. He believed in social equality and social engagement and community responsibility, shared responsibility. And so he invited teachers, parents, even elder children into his child guidance clinics. And Adler would work with a family in front of this group. And some of the professionals, particularly those that were aligned with Freud and psychoanalytic approaches, thought that that was unprofessional. But Adler felt that the parents, the children, the teachers were the true experts, and that his role was to facilitate engagement and sharing with each other. And in that process, he helped many families engage. And there were literally child guidance clinics that surfaced all across Vienna at that time, but they were shut down when the fascists came in. What's important in the work that I've done in this area is the audience and their knowledge and experiences, their observations, their suggestion is what's most important. And so tapping into them at critical points along the way are some key things to keep in mind. The audience is assumed to have similar challenge and issues, and in the 200 or 300 people that attended, and if 80% of those were parents, very likely 20%, 30% of those people at any one time are going to have similar challenges. We were dealing with traditional family counseling work, getting up, mealtime chores, sibling rivalry, not listening, etc., were issues that these families were facing. And by working with one family in front of a large group, you could quickly help many more who were having similar concerns. And so again, I noted the professionals were equals, not above others. Parents and even children were viewed as the experts and what would work for them. The outcomes from this model is a much greater sense of belonging, realizing that you're not alone, that you're not the only one with these challenges or issues, being able to contribute to the common good. That in itself is a wonderful goal, because when we're feeling so discouraged, so lost, so in our own world, our ability to reach out, to have social interest, what Adler called social interest towards others, and social interest is also a determiner of mental health. The more we have the common good in mind, the more we have the interests of others, the more we are considered, quote unquote, healthier. This idea of mutual support, building knowledge of principles in a larger audience with a minimum amount of time, learning through the experiences of others, enhancing a sense of common purpose, and building additional coping skills. So these are some of the outcomes. So before I get into thoughts about an online application, Robin, let me stop for a minute and see if anybody has a comment, a question, an observation that anybody would like to offer at this point.
Okay, and again, I'll remind folks that you can do that by typing that into the chat feature. And while we give folks time to do that, something that came to mind as you were talking, especially about the contribution and thinking about others, is I read not too long ago, maybe a little over a year ago, the Book of Joy by the Dalai Lama. and Desmond Tutu. And both of them really spoke about the social belonging and the connectedness, and that you find joy not by what you get, but by what you give. And so that really kind of, when you said that, it really struck that it's beyond just a single, philosophy or psychology branch, but it really is kind of, it's a human feeling and thought, and contribution. That contribution and social connectedness is so important that it goes beyond just a single discipline.
Absolutely. And I hold on very strongly to the belief that I have to give it away to keep it. And so I go out of my way, such as what I'm offering here, because it helps me so much.
Yes. Well, I don't see anyone chatting or typing, so maybe you can go ahead and move on.
I will go on, but I wanted to at least give people an opportunity. So let me share some thoughts that I've had about the online applications. So this could be clinical. If you have a clinical population, either of kids or of families, parents, teachers, or others, you could address a singular person with a clinical concern, and with some limitations, which I'll share when we talk about preparations, or if you choose to do an open form model. I'll get into that a little bit later in my presentation. And of course, there are some limitations of what you may choose to share within an open format, but you could assume that you're helping much more than the one person or family that you're working with, if there are many other families that are choosing to log on and be part of that, because it's quite likely that many others will have similar concerns. But this could also be a case management focus. It doesn't have to be a particular clinical concern. It could be follow through with given actions that might make a difference. It could be working together to create a set of focused actions that would keep people more stable and secure, and how they're more involved in managing their own care. And so there are as many applications as you can think of. And so I'm sharing an approach that has multiple purposes. While I may speak about it within one frame, feel free to take license to work with it in any way that makes some sense. So you would want to gather data on an issue and concern, whether it's a clinical or a case management related issue or something else. Use the audience for encouragement and suggestions at critical points in the discussion. To maintain control, just as Robin is trying to do here, people can post comments that can be read. You could solicit questions in advance. And with permission and understanding of limitations, sessions might even be recorded for access by others not able to attend, and those recordings can be posted on your website, and you could begin to build a ready access pool of resources that you could title and identify in a certain way. And if this makes sense, even long after you're back doing more face-to-face work, this kind of online engagement still allows opportunities for recordings. And you can even do strategic recordings by later inviting a small group in to a particular session to add a specific resource that you might want to put online and to have available in a much broader way. And anyone could contribute. You could even have clients being willing to add resources, and you could record clients building capabilities, sharing their lessons learned, their best practices, so you could create a community of shared learning. So it's not just one way, and clients can take similar responsibilities in that regard. So some issues to consider and some limitations on this approach. Inviting an individual or a couple or possibly a teacher to be a demonstration client. Of course, if a minor, you will need parents' permission. But in inviting them, one thing I found to be of high value is explaining to them the use, the benefits, the value of them being co-educators. That fact that many in the audience may have similar concerns, and by them being willing to share what's going on in their world, they may be able to help many others that are having similar challenges. And of course, there are limits of confidentiality. And one thing you can say to people that are willing to be demonstration clients is they can decide what to share, what not to share. You can have a brief discussion with them before the session to talk about anything that might be a red flag to steer clear of. But certainly in the meeting itself, you could say that they have the power to simply say, that's not something I want to talk about. And you can say, fine, let's move on. Of course, you as a facilitator, there must be sensitivity to boundaries. Information that may be too confidential, that should not be discussed publicly, such as maybe somebody who's behaved in an abusive way to a child. That's not something we necessarily want to put out there to have them being labeled, but you can certainly talk about, anger and frustration with behavior as a child and other ways to be more effective without ever revealing the abusive situation. You can talk about short fuses, how we all are similar in that way, what other alternatives exist, and you could solicit a range of suggestions from participants in that regard as well. There are some additional issues to consider and limitations. Focuses on common experiences shared by many and families during these challenging times. What I found is once people observe a session, if you ask, are there others that might be willing to volunteer to be a point of focus for future meetings, many will feel more comfortable once they see the use, how the least little rock or the worst thing wasn't overturned, that they were dealing with issues that were common and that everybody could relate to, and the encouragement, the belonging that came out of that, the feeling that I'm not alone was so strong that others will likely be open to volunteer. How frequently you may want to run these sessions might be determined by needs within your population at hand, the level of engagement. I don't think you want to do these daily, but a couple times a week during challenging times certainly might be reasonable. You can also use a traditional group model without demonstration clients and without recording of the session, if that would help. And then you just put people on a schedule, you have them come together as a group. In a small group, you can have people raising concerns and just do traditional group work as you would otherwise. Maybe one person having a partial part of that meeting time, gaining input, seeing what other questions come up. Or you could go in the way that I'm suggesting, is working within a set amount of time, like an hour more, with one person as the focal point and getting others to offer their thoughts, their observations, their suggestions, their observations about strengths, etc., and keep it more targeted. So once you feel comfortable in using this model and these approaches, you're certainly free to experiment with it. I'm not giving you one rigid approach, but I'm giving you some broad guidelines and issues to consider.
I'd like to
What
add
I
something.
want to do
I'd like,
now,
I'm
yeah,
sorry.
go ahead, Robin.
I just wanted to, when you were talking about limits of confidentiality, I did want to make a point to everyone in Indiana. We are all required mandatory reporters. So I think it's important to start any of these sessions by discussing our limits of confidentiality, and sharing that if we are made aware of anything that indicates that someone is being harmed or will be harmed, that we have to report that. I think it's, saying that up front is going to be really important.
Absolutely. And let me take a moment of pause again before I go into a more detailed flow of how a particular open forum session might proceed. Robin, are you aware of any questions that have been typed? Or if you want to unmute all for a minute and we can just let people feel more comfortable just raising a question if they don't feel like typing. What thoughts, what observations, what reactions do you have to what I've shared thus far?
All right. It's not letting me unmute everyone. So if you guys do have something that you want to share, go ahead and unmute yourself to share that verbally. Are you willing to share your slides in a PDF after this is over?
Absolutely. I'm happy to do so.
Yep.
And so I will, I believe you already have a copy of that, so you feel free to distribute that.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess people are more in listening mode. So no information to the chat box yet. So what I want to do next is walk through in quite a lot of detail what a particular open forum session might look like. And since you all have experience or likely have experience in group work or traditional client-centered work, I'm going to spend this time just sharing a more open flow, open forum discussion, with assuming that you've been able to get a volunteer client to be a co-educator, letting you address that client's issues or concerns. So, and again, I don't remember if I've shared a little bit later some pre-work, but you would want to have a discussion in advance, helping people understand this exact flow, what you would be doing, some of what I shared earlier about they're in control of what they choose to discuss and not discuss. And I may address that even in this flow. But so you want to thank the person for being willing to help, ask them how they feel about being in this discussion, and listen intently for tone, for phrasing, because somebody may provide what I've learned is a gold mine. If I say to a particular person, how do you feel about being here and being in this open forum meeting? And they say, oh, it's okay. The words okay are there, but their tone and their phrasing are a gold mine. What is it exactly that they're feeling? Because I'm not comfortable going forward until I understand exactly what they were sharing with their tone, the way that they frame that. And by digging in, you may find that there's some other questions, or they're not quite sure what they've gotten into, but they volunteered anyways. And the art of guessing is very useful here. One thing that I've learned over my years of clinical work and in this open forum work, could it be or is it possible questions are very useful. Could it be it's still uncomfortable for you? Revealing a little bit about yourself to people you may not know. Whatever comes to mind, since the client or will be the one that will say yes or no, even if you're right, if they're not ready to hear something, or if they're not ready to identify it or focus on that yet, they may say no when in fact it's right. But they're the ones that can discuss those issues. And so address any feelings or concerns that they may have. And go ahead. Question, comment?
Yeah, a question. So in a situation where the body language would suggest that, they actually mean something else or feel something else, but verbally they're saying, they're fine. How much is it okay to press for, what's underneath that? How much do you push without getting past those boundaries and not respecting the boundaries? Because
Great. Yeah, wonderful question. I'm sorry, was there more in that?
No, that's essentially.
Yeah. Wonderful question. I love it. So again, the client takes the lead. So I might be transparent. I might say, something isn't quite settled for me in what I am observing and hearing from you. I hear the words okay, but your body language says that maybe things aren't okay. Am I reading you wrong? Is there something there? Should we take another minute to talk about that? Or should we move on?
Okay. Sounds
and
good.
By giving them the choice,
right,
that's the key. And if they say, no, I'm basically okay, let's move on, then trust them. And if there's something later that comes up, if there's another data point that again leads you to feel that something isn't quite right, then you can revisit it.
Okay.
And say to them, you said move on, but here again, I'm sensing that things are not quite right. Help me understand, am I missing something? And sometimes people will be more willing to reveal what's going on. And you could say to them, is there somebody else in the room that's making it hard for you to be honest and talk openly?
Mm-hmm.
And whatever the issues may be that you think are coming up. Other comments, questions? Does that help in responding to what you were raising at that moment?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. And then there's more about establishing a relationship. So it's important at this early stage to reinforce that they're co-responsible in helping others in the meeting. And those listening to recording, note that many people have similar concerns. When I would do this in person, I would ask show of hands, how many in the group would have the courage to do what this person is doing? And maybe 1 or 2 hands would go up out of 200 or 300, and I would say, wow, how great that is, how strong you are. And I would build up the positive aspects that I'm observing. And so you can note that it takes courage and a willingness to give to others, to be willing to share their needs and concerns. And you can remind them again of confidentiality, that they can decide what to share. Remind them that the session is being recorded. You could even say at any point in the work, if they don't want the session to be recorded anymore, they could ask and it could be turned off. So that kind of collaboration right from the beginning can help. And please feel free to unmute yourselves if anybody has a question, an observation, comment as we're going through this, because I think we can manage that in that way. So in establishing a relationship, part of that is also getting into the details of their situation, their concern. But before that, you could ask them to briefly describe their situation. When I was doing family counseling in an open form model, I would ask the parents to describe numbers of kids, extended family, if both parents were there, other close family members or even neighbors that were close that might best describe their current situation. And you can ask the client to describe what's their situation currently. Are they in an apartment building where so many people are on top of each other and it's hard to isolate? Are they more rural and feeling more isolated, alone? How many people are around them? What is their current situation? And you can add whatever questions would be most appropriate. I am not close enough to your work in Indiana to know how you might want to define that. You know your population. You could ask them generally to describe their situation. What that also does is help the people that are on the online world identify. These are people I can relate to. These are people that are similar to me. They're in a similar situation that I'm in. It will help give context. And when you're hearing specific concerns and offering suggestions of support, this context will be particularly useful. And then, so let me just stop. Any questions or comments about a description of their situation? So it's basically the demographics around where they're living, what's going on in their world, how might they be facing generally the situation today. I suppose you can ask about food, nutrition, level of resources available, and again, whether that's too confidential for some families or they're openly willing to share that, that would be up to you and each situation. But before you get into a specific issue or concern, you, along with the audience, have observed a substantial amount already. You've heard a lot from the client. And it would be useful to start with identifying their strengths. And this is also useful because later when you get into a specific concern, you can remind them of strengths that they share themselves, of issues that you noted as strengths for them. So you could say you'd like to hear what they see as the strengths they currently use to face the issues and challenge generally. You could have them list 3 or 4 strengths. You could reinforce that. You can add your own observations. And then you can also ask the audience to comment on what they've observed, what they've heard. And this strength-based approach, I can't emphasize enough as being so critically important. And make sure you take notes so that you're writing down these strengths, because when you get in the midst of problems, it might be easy to forget these issues. And it's really critical that you bring people back to what are their go-to resources that they can rely on, that they may already be building to help them with a level of resilience. Comments about establishing a relationship, and some of the ways that I've talked about using strengths or questions that you may have. No?
Nope, we don't have anything typed in.
Okay, so at this point, once you've set that stage, you've looked at current context, you've observed their strengths, you've gotten audience input into that, then you want to pinpoint the problem, understand specifically the dynamics of a main concern. So you want to ask, what concerns you most today? If there was only one thing that we could address more than anything else, what's top of mind for you? Or if they list 2 or 3 or 4, you could start that way. You could say, what are the 2 or 3 most concerning issues for you? And then you could ask them to pick one. And if you have time, you can come back to follow up with one of the other concerns. But more important that you hone in on one, and you don't want to talk generally about 4 or 5 or 6 issues and then start to raise suggestions and solutions, because you need context, you need details in order to best understand. And there's a couple ways to do that. When you have a main concern, you want to listen and then use active listening. Restate what you heard the client stating. And this is important for a couple ways. First of all, clients need to hear themselves think. And they might come back and say, yes, that's right, that's exactly right. Or they might state, well, that's what I said, but no, that's not what I mean. And a higher level of active listening is actually at guessing at what is not heard, guessing at what may be under the surface that you believe is part of it, but that the client hasn't exactly said. So you could say, what I heard you saying is this, but I'm also wondering if there's a couple other related issues to this. And that's when you can come back to your, is it possible that, could it be that, and raise some other issues. Now, this is a quick way of getting to a broader understanding of that particular issue or concern, and to hear if there are some broader ways that the client may be presenting it, representing it, feeling it, thinking about it. The other thing that you can do, which is actually so simple, but it's so to the point, is you ask for a specific example. So the person might say something like, I'm just so bored all the time. I don't know what to do with myself. We're sitting here staring at the 4 walls, and we have one TV, and I don't always want to be around the rest of my family members, but I'm so bored. So one approach would be that you can start talking about boredom overall and what might be suggestions to counter it. That would be mistaken, because what you want them to do is speak about a specific time when they were feeling bored, because people will fill in details and will give you much more data than you ever imagined. And the biggest mistake that counselors make, that I've seen when I've done clinical supervision, when I've observed clinical work, mistakes I made early on, was taking general statements and trying to give suggestions, solutions, treatment advice, some alternatives just on the general. And what I've learned over the years is I never work with the general. I always use specific examples. So I would say, using the boring example, so can you tell me a recent time when you felt particularly bored? And they might say, well, just last night. And then you can say, where were you? What was going on when you were bored? Give me all the details. And you get every last detail of what they were thinking, what they were feeling, what they were doing, and you will be absolutely amazed at how much more data will become available just by them walking through the example. You'll hear things that are going on, and to get that example, you just simply say, the best way I can understand the issue at hand is to ask for a specific example. Tell me a recent time when you felt that way or thought that way, or share what you experienced. And then go through every last detail. Have them describe what occurred. Then what happened? What did you do? What did others do? What skills did you tap in to address the feelings or the issue? How did it end? If there is a vivid moment that stands out more than others, what part of that example stands out the most? And at that moment, what did you feel? Why did you feel that way? What else could you do? There's so much here. I want to take a minute to unbundle this. A most vivid moment is, well, so let me back up one other step. Adlerians believe in a cognitive belief system. We're not born to believe a certain way. It's not heredity nor environment. It's our own ability to interpret our world and develop conclusions of where we are in the world, a self-concept, a self-ideal, a view of others, a view of the world at large. I'm weak and helpless. Others are so much stronger. The world's a dangerous place. Therefore, in order to be okay, I have to look to others to continually support me. May be a cognitive belief system and a conclusion around that. Now, there are situations that people face every day that they bump into, that they confront. The feelings that are generated, the reactions that they have, are not objective. People react to things based on their own cognitive screen, their own cognitive belief system. And the most vivid moment, the thing that stands out the most, that they're most passionate or most reacting to in that specific example, is the intersection between the situation and their basic beliefs. And when you ask somebody to give a most vivid moment, and then what did they feel at that vivid moment? What were all the feelings that they had? Why did they feel that way? Those questions are like magic. Adlerians do what we call early memories. And by taking a series of earliest memories from before the age of 10 and looking at patterns and themes, we can fairly quickly identify a cognitive belief system. But let me give you a brief example of an early memory that somebody may have given. A person gave the following memory. I was 10 years old. I was playing baseball. It was the bottom of the ninth. The score was tied 9-9. Bases were loaded. There were 2 outs. And I was up at the plate and I struck out. Now, if you didn't ask for the most vivid moment and the feelings, you would project your own interpretation of that situation and the most vivid moment. And you might say, oh my gosh, the person failed, he didn't do well, the team lost, how terrible he must have felt. But so I asked this person, what was the most vivid moment? And the answer was striking out. How did you feel great, wonderful, elated. And that confused the heck out of me at first. And so I asked, why did you feel that way? I felt great. We never, no one ever thought we would get that far. How wonderful. We got to the very end of the championship game. It felt so wonderful to be part of the group and to share the whole season with my teammates. At that moment, we really felt wonderful as a team and what we had accomplished. Now, you never would have gotten that unless you asked for that data. And so understanding the most vivid moment, even if it's not an earliest memory, which is pure, but to ask somebody about a recent situation, you know, what's the most vivid moment of you being bored last night? Well, that I felt so helpless. I couldn't do anything about it. Well, why did you feel so helpless? Usually I know what to do. Usually I have all the answers. Usually other people and my family members are coming to me because I'm the oldest and others are looking to me. And I felt terrible that I was so lost that I couldn't be there for others. Now, without asking the vivid moment and the feelings, you never understand those dynamics. The issue of boredom is less the issue than the issue of not having the answer and not being able to be there for others in the way I'm most used to being there. And that will help you much more understand what are the challenges and what are the issues. And let me stop. I'm hearing a little bit of noise. Does anybody have an observation or a question about this pinpointing the problem, asking for a specific example?
It's me again. I have another question.
Yes.
So, I work with a lot of teenagers, and I am looking for, okay, so I'll ask a lot of questions, and a lot of times the answer is, I don't know. If I ask them how they feel about something, they don't know. And you can even tell with their tone a lot of times, because I'll try to give them, you know, suggest different ideas of what different emotions what an emotion might be like or something. And so then they still will tell you, I don't know. And even with their response, a lot of times they seem frustrated. And my guess is that they're frustrated about not knowing how to even answer the question.
Okay, so Nabrisa.
Yes, Nabrisa.
Is that your first name? Whoever was just talking to me, what is your first name?
Nabrisa.
Nabrisa. Could I ask you to share a specific example?
Oh,
could you provide a recent time?
I can remember a very specific one. Oh dear. I might have to come back to you on that. But
okay, so I think it's important for you to understand context. So if you're asking people for a specific example, can make something up. So if you don't have a specific
a lot of
example.
times it's got a lot to do with even how they felt about the situation. When I get to the part where I'll ask, and how did you feel about that situation? I don't know. Well, might you have felt, you know, frustrated or relieved or happy? I don't know, you know, and that type of a thing.
Okay, so don't get hung up on the feeling aspect. You can, Brisa, you can go and ask them, what were you thinking at that moment? What was going on? What were you aware of what was going on around you? And again, are you speaking generally, or were you speaking about an actual specific example? Because that's where it's potentially you might have gotten hung up. That by honing in on the example and having them describe it, and getting into all the details, because they may not be quite comfortable with a feeling level. Feelings may be a display of weakness. So before you assume that they're just not able to get there, the first thing you can do is have them talk about all the details of that moment that they're aware of. What were they thinking? What were they seeing? What was going on around them? That's one approach that you can use. The other approach is to fall back on this, is it possible or could it be that?
Okay, so I have done that, and that's where I guess it's good to hear somebody else suggest that, because that's where sometimes I worry, because when I suggest things like that, sometimes they will go along with that, and then I don't know if they just do that because they want to move on, or if I've just provided them with, you know, a potential answer because they really didn't know and that sounds good enough. And so then I don't know if I've taken the thing off track, or does that make sense? I don't know if I'm.
Oh, it makes perfect sense. And there's something called a recognition reflex.
Okay.
And first of all, again, we have to trust the person we're working with. And if it's not quite landing on them, it's quite likely, Narissa, that you haven't framed it in their language.
Right.
That you're framing it in your language.
Yes, very likely.
In language that they're not directly identifying with.
Mm-hmm.
And the recognition reflex is an automatic knee-jerk response that people can't help giving.
Okay.
And there's a few ways that that comes across. Either it's a direct statement like, yes, that's right. Is a passionate expression of, that's exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
Or for people that are more cautious with their revealing of their feelings, you'll see a little smirk, a little smile, a change of body posture, something that tells you you're on the right track.
Okay.
And what I would do is assume that your guess may be exactly right. The framing and the language is outside of their worldview. And so you might want to try 2 or 3 or 4 other ways to frame it to see if that's a little closer. And you can use them as an expert. You can say, well, it still feels like there's something here, but I need your help. Help me to get closer to what might, use me, be a Geiger counter and start to make more noise when I'm getting closer.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible that this is going on? Is that it? And you can make 5 or 10 guesses and quickly cover a spectrum, and trust that if people are feeling heard, they're going to have, in their language, they're going to have a recognition reflex.
Gotcha.
Okay, and sometimes it's just that maybe it's less of an issue for them, and then you can say, well, okay, maybe we'll move on. Or there could be issues that to reveal that they feel that way, it comes across as a weakness, particularly in front of other peers.
Mm-hmm.
And that you may have been exactly right, but they're not quite ready to admit it yet.
Mm-hmm.
So in those moments, put it on the shelf, bank it as a possible issue to come back to later. Okay. And then move on.
All right.
Is that helpful?
Yep. Thank you.
Good. Any other observations, questions, comments? Robin, you seem to be somebody that's kind of a sounding board for what others might be thinking or feeling. Any reaction to what I'm saying or doing so far from your perspective?
I think it's a new, so I do think it's a kind of a new perspective, especially to kind of dig into the detail piece. If we're not used to doing like the clinical stuff, I think for the clinicians, they may have that grounded piece. But for, folks who are going to be doing the case management and general programming, just to be able to dig in and to kind of see the broader picture might be a new experience and a new way of looking at things.
And thank you. And there's one other point that's especially useful here, a point of view of holism or systems thinking, or what Rudolf Dreikurs called 2 points on a line. What we're looking for are patterns or themes that tie an individual together into a unified way of thinking and moving through life. For example, you might say a child at home is a perfect angel, but at school constantly acts up. And those are 2 points on a line. What point makes those both seemingly independent points absolutely tied together? And that might be the child's need for attention getting. At home, the child's an only child and is already getting the constant attention of parents. At school, the child is one of 35 students and needs a different behavior in order to have a focus on him or her, even if it's negative. And so once you understand things holistically or from a systems point of view and the goal of attention getting in that example, now you can see much more clearly what's going on with that person. And so by getting at the specifics and digging into the details and looking at those dynamics, a way a child will move through life is very much easier to see and be revealed. And then the other thing you can do is ask for another example. The idea of you want to reinforce what's working, what strengths person used, but ask for another example, because it's within 2 or 3 examples that you'll hear, or more likely hear, a consistent pattern. But you could start with this one and reinforce what's working, what strengths a person used. You could make your own observations, you could make your own guesses, you could stop and ask for guesses from the people that are on the webinar or online, looking at what worked, hearing how others observe what the strengths the person used, what they might like, and then you could ask, would you like some suggestions on what you might be able to do better? But by understanding more clearly those dynamics, that specific example, you'll be in a much better case to understand what's not working and what suggestions might add value. So let me stop and see comments, questions, observations.
I'm back with 2 more.
Go for it.
Okay. One is that you've mentioned Adlerian a few times, and I came into the meeting a few minutes late, not very, maybe 5 or 6 minutes late or so. So I don't know if I missed something at that point, or if you could explain a little bit more what that is. And then after you're done with that, I did think of a specific example.
Beautiful, beautiful. So Adlerian is the teachings of Alfred Adler. And I did not go into details there, but I'll just spend a moment for those of you who may not be familiar with the philosophy of Adlerian psychology. There's a few foundational principles. One is that we're all social beings, and an innate need that actually was reinforced by one of Adler's students, Rudolf Dreikers, was the need to belong, to find a place of significance among our peers. And all problems are viewed as social in nature unless there's genetic limitations or organicity that Adler believed. And as a clinician, having worked for 40 years from this philosophy, I also believe that all challenges and issues are a notion of a way of belonging. It can be on a socially useful or a socially useless plane. It can be very active, it can be passive, but it's our effort to find a place. And Adlerians go even so far as to say depression, while there may be, for example, a genetic link to that, although some research suggests the contrary, how a person uses depression is a misguided way of belonging. If I want others to be there to take care of me, if I feel more helpless, less able on my own, so my depression might serve a purpose of keeping others close, keeping others engaged, having others believe that I'm less capable, less able, and my goal is to belong in that particular way. So that concept of belonging is very strong. The idea of a cognitive belief system. Children are very good observers, but terrible interpreters. And so we'll gather a misguided notion of our self-concept, self-ideal, view of the world, view of others, and conclusions of where our place of significance is. This is what Adler called the lifestyle. And the concept of holism is that it's not independent ideas or behaviors. There's a unifying principle of what ties us together, and it's unique to each individual. Some Adlerian writers, for example, a gentleman named Harold Mozak, spoke about certain types, and these are not labels. These are just conceptual understandings of how we might begin to understand somebody, but every individual is viewed as unique. So the getter, I want what I want when I want it. Life is here only to serve me. The controller, the need to be liked, the need to be right, the one that has to be superior to everybody, the one that's a victim, that everything's against them, a martyr, a baby. These are conceptual types that Mozak talked about that completely organize a person's thinking and how they move through life. Now, this idea of holism, there's another concept, teleology or goal-directed. If I have a need to be liked, I throw that goal out in front of me. And whether I'm with my friends, whether I'm at school, whether I'm with my parents, that goal is primary. And all of my actions, all of my behavior, if that's a correct assessment of something that unifies my way of thinking, it's around this idea of teleology, that the goal of the belief of where my significance is and how I belong and how I strive to achieve it, that becomes a primary issue. Now, that doesn't mean that everything I face in life aligns with that lifestyle view. There are certainly issues around here and now that aren't connected to that belief system. But as you work with individuals over time, their belief system, their lifestyle, their unifying principles will show up. And then because these are a construction of our own way of thinking and seeing the world, it's optimistic because it can be changed. We're no longer having to live by that once we become aware of it. So Narissa, those are some of the foundational Adlerian principles. And I hope that was of value for you and others. So give me the example now.
So I had a student and we worked on a lot of goals and behaviors and things of that nature. And for several months, he was doing really, really well. And then there came a point where I was concerned he had a big need for money for a specific situation. And he tried all the best ways to go about getting this money, legal ways and whatnot. And then things that I was hearing in conversation and whatnot, I was concerned that he had resorted to possibly some illegal activity or something in order to get this particular money for this very specific thing. So I had talked to him about this, and just mentioned my concern. And he had mentioned that I was correct. He didn't say what it was, but he said he was gonna stop, and that it was just this thing that he had done for this very specific thing, and that he was not going to continue, and asked if I was going to talk to his mother about it. And so it was tricky. And so I mentioned to him, you know, we'll play it by ear as of right now. We'll leave it as is, but if I get the sense that, you know, it's continuing or whatnot, I will likely say something to your mother about this.
Okay.
And so I wonder, and so he was okay with that, but then stuff happened, and I didn't necessarily have a reason to think that he had continued, but I was still concerned. And so I would have talked to him about it directly, but he was absent for a while, so I wasn't able to. Long story short, I'll try and make it shorter. I ended up talking to his mother about it. And soon after, and I told him straight away that I had as soon as I was able to. But soon after that, things completely deteriorated with our relationship. And you have said many times, trust the student, or trust the client. So I'm wondering if that was the mistake, because when I would ask him what has happened, what's changed, because he would say that he would hated me, and I was like, what changed? And so I wonder if that is what it was, because he would say, I don't know, I just do.
Yeah. So let me ask a question of you and Robin also. The way that you heard that in a more general statement without knowledge of specific crimes, I assume you had no legal obligation to report it. Is that assumption correct?
Are you asking me?
I'm asking Nerissa, you or Robin?
Yeah, it was something more of like stealing nature.
I understand that, but you didn't have knowledge of a specific crime.
Correct.
And so under that assumption, you had no legal right to report it.
Correct, as far as I understand it.
And Robin, you could jump in if you understand it differently. Is that correct?
I mean, she didn't have any specific information, so I would say that that would be correct.
Okay. And so the question is, are you an advocate to help this client understand his risk factors and his decision choices?
Yep, and that's exactly what we did.
But, you know, or are you an advocate to be the authority?
Well,
Because
it's a tricky line within my position. It's kind of both.
But why do you think the relationship deteriorated? Because of the fact that you took on the role of an authority figure and you didn't allow him the ability to come to decisions on his own about that. It was as if you had to believe that, you know, now his mom and the relationship with mom, maybe you had a piece of knowledge that would lead you to believe that she could help control him. How old was he?
16.
16. At that point, he's going to make decisions and choices regardless of parental input and parental control. And his own ability to make those internal choices is more important than you taking a position to have to inform on him. And you blew, it seems likely, especially based on his reaction, that you blew the relationship.
Right.
So I'll tell you a quick little story. Early on in my career, I was a substitute guidance counselor for 8 months, filling in the role of a regular guidance counselor who was on extended sick leave. And the assistant principal told me if I ever heard of anything with the kids, I should let him know. And I was making unbelievable progress with really troubled kids and building relationships. And one day the kid told me there was going to be a fight in the cafeteria. And I went to the assistant principal. I said, remember you told me no, confidentiality and all the rest of that. This is what I heard. Maybe you could just alert the teachers that are in the cafeteria so they could more quickly react if something were to come up. What happened? The gym teacher went up to this kid in front of all of his friends in line and said, I heard there's going to be a fight in the cafeteria today. Not on my watch, there isn't. And it completely ruined my relationship with that child and all the other kids I was working with. They all turned their back on me. And for the rest of that year, which was like 2 months, I couldn't work with any of them. And I learned a really hard lesson in life, that your role in working with him, particularly that he was so honest in sharing that he had done that, you could have asked some questions. Would you like to discuss some, so first of all, I would have made a guess. Could it be that this issue that you wanted or needed was so important that you decided even to risk something illegal to get it? And he would admit, yes, that's right. I would say, is that what's important going forward? Are you telling me that in the future, when you have something that's really important that you can't afford, you're going to do illegal activities again? Is that what you want for yourself? Where do you draw the line? Where do you make better decisions? How do you decide to forego your needs and save for what you want or need? And I'm not going to pass judgment, kid, on your decision. Maybe this was so important. Maybe it was life or death for one of your family members, and that you felt you had no other obligation to do that. Help me. Would it be helpful if we spent some time talking about a decision process of how you come to decide what's really important and what risks you're really willing to take, so that you will have more resources when faced with this situation again? That might have allowed you a broader opportunity to work with them and not just take on the role of the authority. And in most cases, unless you're subject to laws where you have to report something, you need to err on the side of working with the child's decision process, himself or herself, and let it be choice on their part, because they're going to do that anyways in spite of you.
Right.
Does
Well,
that make sense?
yeah, it is. And your suggestions on how I might have handled it better are very helpful, because that's something that I struggle with sometimes, is how do I help them thinking forward on how to maybe handle things a little bit differently. So I appreciate your time. Let's move on, because
well, let me model for a second and ask the group any suggestions or observations about what Narissa did well, or other things she could have done within that situation. And maybe for sake of time, people don't want to spend the time there, but I want to model what I'm trying to teach. If no comments, we'll move on. And that's not to say you didn't demonstrate a lot of.
We spent quite a bit of time on this, so I appreciate.
Okay.
Thank you.
So tap into audience suggestions. Spend time hearing and reading each suggestion, asking if the client finds it useful. If the audience is reticent, like this audience is, then raise the guesses. Raise a tentative of things that you can think about that may allow that client to think broader. And then let me address case management for a minute. If working in a small group as part of case management, you could have people talk directly instead of writing their comments. And in a small group, you don't even need to use a chat box. Everybody can be unmuted. But if you're working with one person, what I found is having the audience talk to you rather than directly to that client, it's just allows a little bit more control of the flow, particularly if somebody's raising something that you think is not the most constructive. You can stop it. You can say, wait a minute, I don't think that that's a useful thing to go down. And it's easier if they're talking to you rather than talking directly to a particular designated client you're working with. Unless there's already a well-established relationship among the people, it's a way for you to better control that situation. And then, as I said earlier, ask for other examples, but then if time allows, ask for another concern. Be thoughtful of how much can be addressed in one meeting. 30 to 40 minutes with some time at the end for engagement, questions, and answers probably is sufficient. But sometimes people would like to address something else. You could say, do you have any other concerns that you would like to address today? And again, get another specific example until you see patterns, and then follow the same process. One other thing that you can do is to review a typical day. This is much more general, and it may not be a specific day, but you could say, tell me an example of a day that might be happening right now. Describe a day that's most typical to your world right now and what you're living. And to do that, you could say, I'd like to now examine a typical day so that I may understand your situation more broadly. Ask for as many details as might be helpful. Ask about getting up, the morning routine, how they're sharing resources in the home, such as technology, video, cell phones, time on the computer, time in the afternoons, evening routine, how they might be supporting each other, addressing differences. You will be amazed at how much information comes out, and you may find the real issue is revealed in the typical day, not what the client said was the main concern. That a light bulb might go off as to something totally different that's going on that you might want to address, and you can bring that in by being transparent, saying we've been talking about these other concerns, but I'm hearing something here that seems even more important. May I take a moment to share it with you? May I take a moment to offer some observations as to what I'm hearing you say? And then say, how does that land on you? Does that make sense? Do you want to spend a few minutes discussing this, or have we done enough? Again, always leaving the control with the clients. Then when you've gone through that, then you want to go through next steps. Note the strengths the client has used, solicit observations from other people observing the session on strengths, offer some suggestions on ways they might do things differently, get suggestions from the group, ask them to share what's worked for them. And some people will say, you know, well, this is the way I've approached it, and this has really helped me. And it's like, it's beautiful. It's just masterful the way other people can share their own approaches, their own resources as to what they've done. Then you go back to the client, and you could say, of all the suggestions, which ones do they feel are most useful? What are they willing to implement? You could invite them back at the beginning of a next meeting to share what worked for them before you started working with somebody else, to review progress. You could also arrange follow-up one-to-one time as a way of offering further support, engagement, and if the session was particularly impactful, you might want to consider doing that. So that's a basic flow. We are scheduled for 2 hours. It's an hour and 23-minute mark into my presentation. I'm happy to open it up generally for observations, for questions, even if you're just choosing to share what's going on in your world right now. I'm happy to use the opportunity as an outside consultant to have you hear your own frustrations, your own concerns with the work you're doing. Even if you don't think you would use these approaches, I'm happy to model and demonstrate this work in our remaining time together if you're open to sharing an observation or raise a question. You can all unmute yourselves if you want, and we can see how we might proceed at this point in our discussion together.
So we do have a comment. Brooke commented on Abrisa's example, and she said that she's talked with the teen about how he or she can tell his mom and then role play it, offering to do it with the teenager so that they can facilitate the disclosure and the interaction between the teen and parent. She said this allows you to help the client take ownership, practice appropriate communication, resolve conflict, address relationship dynamics, etc. And it may also help preserve the therapeutic relationship because the teen feels supported.
I love that suggestion, and that's assuming the teen wants to tell mom.
True.
Right, which is one assumption, but you know, the idea of informing could be part of that teen's recovery, and the teen may be afraid as to the parental reaction too, and so that support in role playing, asking how that parent might typically react. What are the frames that the team could use that would maybe get a different reaction from mom? Because what we want to do is foster open communication and support. And if the mother just goes off and punishes the child because the child was open or overreacts, that goes against what the goal of the teen might be in sharing that with mom. But I love, Brooke, I love the suggestion. It's a great approach. Other comments?
So
I know, go ahead.
Stacy has a question. She wanted to know, in this model, how long are the sessions?
I would not, I mean, you typically, especially online, I probably would not go longer than an hour. Just because in person when we've done them, it was a 2-hour session, but it allowed much more visual cues, dynamic engagement with an audience, immediate feedback interaction, being able to see recognition reflexes of the client and the audience. But online, I think you begin to lose attention. And if you're working with one client in front of the audience, you really want to start engaging the audience right from the beginning, and hoping that they'll either type questions or unmute themselves and be involved right from the beginning. I once did work with a family with the person that was training us in front of an audience of 300 people. I said literally 10 words, and the person that was training me told me I had failed. And when I asked him what I did, he said I didn't involve the audience early enough. And so you really want to engage the audience right from the beginning, as they're also co-educators. And the question of how many of you would have courage to open up like Samantha is doing, whoops, sorry, I hit my mouse. And so I'm at the beginning anyways, but that Samantha is doing starts to engage them right from the beginning. So maybe 40 minutes and then engagement of the audience, but an hour probably is the right time frame.
What about a number? Do you have a specific suggestion around number of clients, to, especially if it's teenagers?
Well, that's a great point. If you're working with one in the traditional model and teenagers are their observers, I mean, you can literally have 50 people on the webinar, and mute everybody and have them unmute themselves, when they're ready to talk. If it's a cohort that's used to working together, you could do as little as 4 or 5. You could do as more dynamic cohort, 10 or 12. But I'm working actually with somebody in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, who is trying to do this work with an entire community. And he's trying to get permission from Zoom to have 1,000 people observing.
Wow.
And you can do that in the traditional model that I've laid out of working with one family, soliciting feedback as you are, and controlling that. There's really no limitation of how many people would actually observe the work if you're managing and controlling it in the right way. And with so many people isolated today, this person in Edmonton, Alberta is really excited, and I'm meeting with him next week as to mentoring and helping him get this off the ground so that he can advertise this link throughout all of Edmonton and even solicit news media to engage in that. And I don't see any different in your agency that you could go beyond existing clients and your brand, not that you want to do it because of brand notification, but I guess it doesn't hurt either. And if you open this up to the entire Indiana, Fort Wayne, or whatever communities that you're all in, and you have the capability of technology that allows that, that's the real limitation. I know when we were doing this today, Robin noted a maximum of 25 people given the GoToMeeting technology that was capable. And so that's the biggest concern. But I know technology, if it's not a limitation, you could get multiple hundreds of people observing this work and have community impact on a much different level.
We have a couple of questions. So there's one that says, I feel that it's sometimes very hard to keep people engaged, even in person, and this can become even harder right now, so virtually. And she wants to know, is she wrong in that feeling? Am I alone? And she says,
you're not alone. I would say to you that there's a different level of engagement when you're working with a particular person who's willing to unveil as much as they're willing to talk about personally. There's something quite compelling about listening in to somebody else's story. That's why stories have such an important role when you're giving talks, when people are being engaged. It's the identification with what somebody's story is that can be a catalyst to more engagement, but it's certainly something that can be still challenging.
Okay, we have another comment. Dana Thomas says, I am the director for a community-based service. We have probably 60 plus providers, both clinical and support providers, who are transitioning services through this time. We have been trying to stay connected and support them in hopes that they will in turn make them available for individuals and families we work with. Some are struggling and morale seems low. I enjoyed your description of and modeling of this approach and was wondering if we might discuss an intervention or training with our providers that could both introduce them to this approach and have the opportunity to process through some of their own current struggles.
Well, at the very beginning of the presentation, if you were on, I noted that my own value system is you have to give it away to keep it. And so if there would be value, I'd be happy to offer this to your providers. Or you can make this recording available to them. They could observe this, and then I'd be happy to jump on a more dynamic call where we could talk about questions that may come up. And so I will leave that to you and Robin to look at what might be a most useful approach that would allow you to support your providers in the best way?
So Dana, you can reach out to me and we can discuss what we'll be able to do. And this is being recorded right now. Once we are off of this, I'll have to convert the recording and then upload it, but it will be on the Indiana Youth Service Association YouTube channel. And you do have to go to YouTube and type in Indiana Youth Service Association. So sometimes it takes a little bit to convert. Probably by the end of the day, certainly by tomorrow, this will be available on YouTube. And thanks again to Dr. Kolker for allowing us to do that.
Oh, my pleasure. What other comments or questions? And again, it can go beyond this approach. I want to model what I've been presenting. How are you all feeling? You all have to be out of sorts. Maybe you've talked yourselves out with each other, and this is a vacation for a moment from all those feelings. And then I wouldn't want to turn those back on if you found that you'd rather just enjoy the moment of distraction. But other comments or questions on this approach? So, maybe while that's happening, I'll share a funny example. So I was doing open forum family counseling, as I noted, at the Adler School of Professional Psychology, now Adler University. And afterwards, a woman came up to me and she said she would love to bring her 2 boys to come to a session, but she knows they would never come. So I said to her, I'd be happy to give her a suggestion, and if she followed it to the letter, I could almost guarantee that they would be willing to come. And she said, what? And I said, I want you to go home and I want you to tell the boys that you observed some crazy approach where a counselor was working with a family in front of a large audience, and that you spoke with the counselor afterwards, and the counselor said, well, he couldn't 100% guarantee it. If the boys came, he could almost guarantee that he could help get mom off their backs. And she said she would do that. She called me a day later. She says, the boys don't want to wait a month. They want to come right away. And so I invited them to be the demonstration family for the next session. And it turns out this was a Chicago policewoman. And she knew of the danger of the streets. And she was insisting that the boys immediately came home from school and did their homework. And the boys simply wanted some time to have some fun before they started it. And all it took was an acceptance that the boys needed some time out and negotiation around safety that would lead her to feel that the boys were safe, and they agreed to call her as soon as they got home. They would inform her where they're going. They would inform her when they got there, what they were doing, if they were going to play outside, whatever they would. She agreed to a certain time frame of when they would check in with her, and they committed to doing that, and they followed through. And she came back for a follow-up meeting, and she could not believe the change in the boys and how cooperative they were in doing their homework. And she just had to come to terms with her own issues around safety and the impact that was having on her 2 adolescent children. And that came out of her volunteering because she had observed some previous work that we gave and what went on. And the audience was just amazed at the transformation and the change that went on. Another example that actually became something that we worked with, which was kind of borderline, but in terms of how much to discuss, but a woman brought her family, and she presented that she was having a real issue with food. and she was having a constant power struggle with her two adolescent girls because of their eating habits. And it turns out, as part of the discussion, it became a little bit more clinical than maybe it could have, but she claimed that growing up she had her own eating disorders and she was projecting her fears onto her daughters, and we had to somehow realign her own fears with that was she was projecting, because her daughters were really close to having eating disorder issues just because of the way they were rebelling so much against mom's pressure that she was putting on them. And so we were able to make substantial headway. And that session was in front of 300 people in an audience. Wow. But she, you know, and I checked in with her, is this something you're willing to openly discuss? And she said, you know, absolutely, because she had enough of this already, and it became a very frank and open discussion. But I checked in continually to make sure we weren't going beyond appropriate boundaries. But it made a huge difference, and she never would have come to understand that unless we had gone through that discussion process. So those are some additional examples. Are there other comments or questions, Robin?
I don't have anything that's typed in right now. I do have a question. It's been a while, but I have worked with teenagers. That was my career when I was a direct provider as a clinician, was working with teenagers, and they are notoriously closed-mouthed, especially in a group. So if we're doing this virtually, do you have recommendations on how to engage them? Is that, should we all have our, like, you're the only one that has their picture up right now. Should we be using videos if they have that capacity? What are your suggestions around that?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many fun and creative things that you could do. For example, I mean, yes, I think you could use video unless there's technology limitations. With Zoom, you can use video. I don't know, you know, if you have a maximum of 10 or 12 people in a Zoom session, if you have access to that. But you could have some fun things. For example, you could do a group session and you could have children role playing somebody else in the group. And you could have an entire discussion with John not being John, but being Sam. And John talking like Sam, thinking like Sam, answering the way Sam would act. And you could do that for 15 to 20 minutes. And then you could have people take on their original personas, and you could say, what have you learned? What did you learn about John that you didn't know already? Or John, was the portrayal that Sam made of you, was that accurate or not accurate? And you can have so much fun and engage people, and other people will say so much more of what they know, what they think, what they guess the other person will feel than the person may say himself or herself. And there's fun activities like that that can get people much more open and engaged and willing to reveal themselves. Or you could have people introduce each other in the group of what they know of them, and you could have pick straws out of a hat, or you could assign people, and you could say, today I'd like you to introduce and say what you know about this person and what they like, what they don't like, and then the person, you could go to the person, you could say, how accurate were they? Did that work? Did that not work? Were they close? On a scale of 1 to 10, were they a 0? Were they an 8? What did they miss? And you'll get a lot more information and flow within a group like that if you use some of these creative rather than just traditional approaches.
I would imagine you'd have to do that with a group where the trust has been established.
You would. You absolutely would, because especially online, if they don't know each other, that wouldn't be there. Or if there were people within the group that really didn't like each other, that you were then asking them to do that, you could stir a negative pot.
Right.
But for an ongoing group where there's a lot of trust and that they've been interacting together for a period of time, that might be a fun activity to consider.
Thank you. Does anyone else have other questions, comments?
If not, Robin, just maybe you could be an alter ego for a minute. And I'm not asking you this to help me feel good, but just how much do you think that this presentation aligned with what might be needed right now? How much of this might people already know, like the clinical versus the case management side? What do you think are people's takeaways? And maybe while you're starting, I could ask others, how have I helped you today? What are you taking away from this? That would be encouraging to me. And so if you could give a word or 3 words of just something that you learned, something that you're taking away, if you could type that out, that would be great. Or you could unmute yourselves once Robin's finished and you could just jump in. So maybe I'll start with you. What are your takeaways, Robin? What have you learned through this, and how has this helped you?
I think one of my reasons that I wanted to do this and the appeal of this model is because it is so strength-based, and people typically are more willing to share ideas if it's about someone else rather than their own individual struggles. And it still will resonate with them, in, kind of personally, but because it's like someone who's been brave and volunteered, there's just so much more information, strengths-based information that can come out of that particular setting that I think, especially with kids, will be, well, and even with parents, will be just really, really helpful. That's the piece that I really love about this model. And there is a question.
Yes.
How would you suggest handling a group if the students are at odds with each other?
So resistance is a misalignment of goals. And we could spend an entire 2 hours just talking about that, and my 40 years of experience learning how to align goals. Now, this is not just tasks. This could be lifestyle goals, where my goal is to be in control and your goal is to get all the attention. And that's why we're at so odds with each other, because I'm not able to control you because you're trying to take all the attention, and my goal is different. So you need to start by talking about the kids as to what's most important right now. Do you want to stay at odds with each other, and do you want to continue to show who's right and who's wrong? If so, then let's talk about how you can do that even better. Because we can talk about how you can fight even more effectively, and how you can really strive to win. And if that would be a way that we can unify all of you around a useful goal, then let's go for it. And otherwise, what other goals are more important? Are you willing to set aside your goals and set aside your differences to deal with other things that may be important right now? Sometimes that discussion can have value. What you don't want to do is put people more at odds by saying that their approaches are not valid for them. You want to help them understand the goal they're trying to achieve in the approach that they're using, and then ask them to consider other, maybe higher level goals and ways that they might align more than continue to be at odds with each other.
Thank you. Dana says, I was just going to mention that when I was in grad school at Spalding, they were running a pilot program with families who were dealing with members who had a history of addiction and recovery. It was modeled very close to this approach, but it was in person. And she said it was amazing to actually see the interaction and growth between individuals and families. It does seem to require a skilled therapist to draw out and seek engagement and the direction and direct this session. I do greatly appreciate a training that is actually displaying the opportunity to develop the actual skills, but often have trouble finding higher level training for my more experienced providers. Any suggestions would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, great point. It does take higher level skills. I think the issue could be one of transparency, and secondly, working within teams. So by transparency, what I mean is you could publish a flow of a session, even with the audience, and be transparent of the process you're trying to use, and that you're learning a little bit while you're doing it, but these times require us to all kind of branch out a little bit more. And so if you ask the audience to keep you accountable to this flow, this outline, and Robin's going to email these PowerPoints, and the last section is the whole flow. If you ask the audience to help you stay focused and help you if you appear stuck, then that's one way you can learn while doing. The second thing is to have co-facilitators, not doing this on your own. Under normal times, workloads doesn't allow you to do this, but if your time is a little bit different because you have the opportunities online and you have more downtime, then you could consider co-facilitators and a strategy of an active person with the other person keeping a little bit more attention to the flow, to audience engagement, to questions that may come up as Robin was doing. So co-facilitators is another way to approach that. There is Adlerpedia.org, and I don't know that I have a family counseling, but I actually have a 2-hour demonstration. If you go to Adlerpedia.org and click on the search glass and type in my last name, Kolker, C-O-L-K-E-R, don't hit enter, just type my last name, and scroll to the bottom and go to the 5th menu of all of the recordings. There's a recording of myself doing a 2 hours within an audience of actual lifestyle assessment with an adjunct instructor in Vancouver, Canada, and it will model a lot of these demonstration principles. And Adlerpedia.org itself is a wonderful site for many of the introductory flow of ideas and approaches. There's an introduction to Adlerian psychology in there. Actually, there's a 3.5 hour introduction to organizational development that I think covers, that I did, that covers some organizational, that covers some of these principles a little bit. But that 2-hour lifestyle assessment demonstration may provide some modeling that you could have people watch and then come together to discuss the model. Those are some initial thoughts that I have. There's also a book by a woman named Grunwald. It's a little out of print. You might still be able to find it. Grunwald and Maccabee, I believe, Guiding the Family, which covers much of this approach to this work and how to achieve that. But those are some initial suggestions that I have.
Okay, and Stacy had a comment and a question. So
okay.
Things that she's taken away, looking at the sense of belonging, acknowledging strengths, mutual support, the idea of working with specific situations, and she likes the idea of co-education, co-educators and partnerships. It is a reinforcement of collaborative relationships. I think my question is the practicality of this model within my context, which is there a combination of open forum and individual sessions?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, if you have time and you're working with a dedicated cohort, then I think that maintaining individual is useful. I think one theme could be, how can we best support each other when we're on the group call, and what are some things that are getting in the way? Because people are functioning socially, and helping them look at how they're showing up, how they're collaborating with others, how their own selfishness starts to show. There's a wonderful story, I have another minute or two, of a centipede that's walking along, all legs, 100 legs beautifully flowing, marching like he's in the army. And it came across a beetle, and all legs came to attention. And the beetle said, I so admire the way you move, but I have a question. Does your 57th foot move before or after your 56th foot? And the centipede starved to death. He became so busy watching his own feet, he could no longer move. And that's what Adler called vertical movement, that my own needs take precedence over the needs of the group, rather than thinking collaboratively and collectively of the whole and how we can mutually support each other. It's about my status, my being stronger, my getting what I want out of this situation, my avoiding being revealed as being weak and being helpless, my proving that I'm stronger than all of you and I'm successful and I can make it. And our goal in our work is to move people from the vertical plane to the horizontal plane, from being self-focused to being other-focused. And the individual work could be geared towards giving people actions in ways that they could think or feel that can lead them to take more advantage of the group. And ultimately, it's lead them to take more advantage of how they're cooperating and collaborating with the demands and needs of the situation in life. Those are life lessons that every one of us should know.
Well, thank you very much. We are getting close to the 3 o'clock hour, and I believe that this was extremely helpful. A lot of information to take so that we can pass this along to our youth and our parents, and find ways to continue to support them during this really, difficult and unprecedented time. This gives us another tool for reaching out and making sure that our families are okay. There's some thank yous in the chat feature. Want to acknowledge those, and we appreciate so much your volunteering your time and your expertise.
I'm more than happy to do so. And Robin, if you have a moment after we're done, I'd be happy to just call you up to hear anything else you might have, or other ways I could support you.